In 1796, the scientist Edward Jenner injected material from a cowpox virus into an 8-year-old boy, with a hunch that this would provide the protection needed to save people from deadly outbreaks of the related smallpox virus. It was a success. The 8-year-old was inoculated against the disease, and this became the first ever vaccine. But why did it work? To understand how vaccines function, we need to know how the immune system defends us against contagious diseases in the first place. When foreign microbes invade us, the immune system triggers a series of responses in an attempt to identify and remove them from our bodies. The signs that this immune response is working are the coughing, sneezing, inflammation, and fever we experience, which work to trap, deter, and rid the body of threatening things like bacteria. These innate immune responses also trigger our second line of defense, called adaptive immunity. Special cells called B cells and T cells are recruited to fight microbes and also record information about them, creating a memory of what the invaders look like and how best to fight them. This know-how becomes handy if the same pathogen invades the body again. But despite this smart response, there's still a risk involved. The body takes time to learn how to respond to pathogens and to build up these defenses. And even then, if a body is too weak or young to fight back when it's invaded, it might face very serious risk if the pathogen is particularly severe. But what if we could prepare the body's immune response, readying it before someone even got ill? This is where vaccines come in. Using the same principles that the body uses to defend itself, scientists use vaccines to trigger the body's adaptive immune system without exposing humans to the full-strength disease. This has resulted in many vaccines, which each work uniquely, separated into many different types. First, we have live attenuated vaccines. These are made of the pathogen itself, but a much weaker and tamer version. Next, we have inactive vaccines, in which the pathogens have been killed. The weakening and inactivation in both types of vaccine ensures that pathogens don't develop into the full-blown disease. But just like a disease, they trigger an immune response, teaching the body to recognize an attack by making a profile of pathogens in preparation. The downside is that live attenuated vaccines can be difficult to make, and because they're live and quite powerful, people with weaker immune systems can't have them, while inactive vaccines don't create long-lasting immunity. Another type, the subunit vaccine, is only made from one part of the pathogen, called an antigen, the ingredient that actually triggers the immune response. By even further isolating specific components of antigens, like proteins or polysaccharides, these vaccines can prompt specific responses. Scientists are now building a whole new range of vaccines called DNA vaccines. For this variety, they isolate the very genes that make the specific antigens the body needs to trigger its immune response to specific pathogens. When injected into the human body, those genes instruct cells in the body to make the antigens. This causes a stronger immune response and prepares the body for any future threats. And because the vaccine only includes specific genetic material, it doesn't contain any other ingredients from the rest of the pathogen that could develop into the disease and harm the patient. If these vaccines become a success, we might be able to build more effective treatments for invasive pathogens in years to come. Just like Edward Jenner's amazing discovery spurred on modern medicine all those decades ago, continuing the development of vaccines might even allow us to treat diseases like HIV, malaria, or Ebola one day.
Life is a story about risks, the ones that we actually calculate and weigh out, and the other ones that we just accept as part of a life well lived. We could die playing table games, skiing, running, jogging, dance party, which in my mind is probably the best way to go. It could be as simple as jumping on your bike or getting in a car. Averaged across the population, we have a 1 in 112 chance of dying in a motor vehicle incident. Yet most of us accept those odds for the convenience of traveling from point A to point B. And while this is a story about risk, it's not about dying, it's about living. See, for me, the choice was easy. I view the vaccine the same way I view a car seat. In the event of one of those motor vehicle incidents, my child is safer in a car seat. In the event of a measles outbreak, he's probably safer if he's been vaccinated. And he has. This is my son at his 2-month checkup just after he got the vaccines, and yes, I'm that weird parent that takes pictures of their kids after they get vaccinated. On the right, his immunization record, which as of 2 weeks ago at his 15-month checkup, he is up to date, not delayed, no exemptions. But this is Boulder, and I realize that the choice for many of you isn't as easy as it was for me. If by chance you turn to the internet or the GOP debate, then you know just how confusing these messages might be. And the reality is, we're parents, we're just trying to make the best decision for our children. But how did we get here? Now, vaccination has a really long history. But if we just dial it back 60 years ago to an auditorium like this one, Dr. Francis revealed the results of the Salk polio vaccine trial. It was one of the largest medical experiments in history, consisting of 1.8 million children. Safe, effective, and potent. Immediately thereafter, the March of Dimes launched a national ad campaign, and some of the most notable celebrities of that era showed up to be the face of vaccination. Fast forward a few decades, we have a slightly different situation. On the top is Andrew Wakefield, whose fraudulent paper trying to link the MMR vaccine to an autism-like disorder has since been retracted. He was a fraud. The whole story was fabricated, and he was part of a host of an amazing number of ethical issues. Since then, over 100 studies have definitively shown that there is no link between autism and vaccines. Yet celebrities like Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey continue to push this dangerous agenda. It usually starts with a story, and then another story about a friend or a neighbor. But let me remind you that the plural of anecdote is not data. And perhaps more troubling than that is that a lot of the resources that are designed to incite fear about vaccinations cherry-pick data sets out of context to tell a story that isn't even there. So I present this joke slide from Redditor Jason P55, which it turns out if you cherry-pick the rise in organic food sales over time, and you lay that on a chart with the rise in autism spectrum disorder diagnoses, it looks pretty compelling. But I think we can all agree that more than likely, the root cause of autism isn't organic food. This is Boulder. So what's the risk? The problem is that we're sitting in a hot, dry forest on a windy day just waiting for a match. Because Colorado kindergartners have the lowest measles vaccination rate in the entire country. And we live in a global community. People from all over the world travel into and out of Boulder all the time. This map shows countries highlighted in red that have experienced measles outbreaks in the first 6 months of 2015. Many of those countries are pretty popular destinations. But maybe you're like me, or a lot of people in this room, and you've never even seen measles. And the reason for that is that vaccination is a victim of its own success. You see, we've done such a good job of vaccinating in this country over the past few decades that we don't know what those diseases look like anymore. And it becomes an out-of-sight, out-of-mind situation. But now the vaccination rates are starting to drop, and the tides are turning. This is what measles looks like. It's the only medical image in the whole talk, but I thought it was important enough to just pause and reflect for a minute on what a sick child looks like, a child with measles. But let me draw the picture of what measles looks like. Because for the first 4 days, somebody just presents with cold-like symptoms. Runny nose, fever, cough, sore throat. They're contagious. After about 4 days, the rash sets in. And for another 4 days, that person is still highly contagious. It's one of the most contagious viral diseases known. On the top, we see the number of people that one infected person would likely infect in a susceptible population. On the left, you see Ebola, where one infected person is only likely to infect 2 other people on average in that susceptible population. On the far right, measles, 18. One person with measles may infect up to 18 people in that susceptible population. And the reason that it's so contagious is that it's an airborne disease. It can actually persist in the airspace for up to 2 hours after an infected person has coughed or sneezed. So you can imagine, with your tongue planted firmly in your cheek, why someone might say, "Our thoughts are also with the measles-ravaged country, America. I hope we are screening them before they come to Africa." But as I said, this is a story about risk. So let's actually compare the risks of the disease versus the vaccine. Let's take this front row right here, 20 people. Let's give them measles, sorry. With that, we would expect 2 people to have ear infection, 2 people to have diarrhea, and 1 person to have pneumonia, which I might add is one of the deadliest complications of measles. Now, if we swap that out for 20 people with the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, we'd expect to have just over 3 people with a fever and 1 with a mild rash. Getting back to the disease, if we scale that population out to 1,000 people, we'd expect to also find 1 person with encephalitis, or swelling of the brain tissues, which can have severe permanent damage, and 1 to 2 people would die. However, we have to scale the population out to 1 million vaccinations to see 1 severe reaction. Now, perhaps you're willing to roll the dice, perhaps you're willing to take that chance. And the problem is, while this is a personal decision, it affects other people. Vaccinations work based on herd immunity. When the population is not vaccinated, disease spreads rapidly through a community. When only part of a community is vaccinated, that disease still spreads very easily. However, when most of a population is vaccinated, we can contain that disease. In the case of measles, that number is 95%. 95% of the population would need to be vaccinated to contain measles. So let's see how we stack up. Remember that hot, dry forest I mentioned? This is a sample of a few schools in Boulder Valley School District that have some of the lowest vaccination rates in the community. And you can see this red line represents that 95%. These are some pretty serious gaps. We should be trying to close this gap on vaccination because that 95% is what keeps us all safe. Now imagine a student shows up at Gold Hill Elementary with cold-like symptoms. 4 days later, when that rash shows up, a large percentage of that student body has measles. Because in a susceptible population where people aren't vaccinated, estimated about 90% of them will get measles. But maybe it's not the disease or the complications that bother you. Maybe that's not what keeps you from getting vaccinated. So let's just pick on 2 of the most hated ingredients in a vaccine for the sake of time: aluminum and thimerosal. Aluminum is in the vaccine in the form of aluminum salts. They're used as an adjuvant, which is just a fancy word for something in the vaccine that makes your immune system respond even more efficiently. Here's the thing about aluminum, though. It's the 3rd most abundant element on Earth. It's all around you. It's in the air you breathe, it's in the food you eat, and it turns out we're actually pretty good at getting rid of it. So let's look at aluminum in the first 6 months and compare the amount in vaccines to what you might find in breast milk or formula. Now this amount is milligrams. These are small. a milligram or a thousandth of a gram. And for reference, a gram is roughly a fifth of a teaspoon of water. Small doses. And this shouldn't raise the alarm on soy formula, because it turns out that the amount in 6 months of soy formula is the same as about roughly 1 antacid, similar to the one I took before this talk. Now, thimerosal is a slightly different story. It is a mercury-containing compound. It was found to do an excellent job of being a preservative for vaccines to protect them from contamination. The thing about thimerosal is there isn't actually a lot of evidence that shows any harm in the doses in vaccines from this compound. Yet even despite that lack of evidence, as of the year 2000, most vaccines don't use thimerosal. So I bring up this chart. These are the immunizations my son has received at Boulder Community Hospital in the first 15 months of his life. You can see that all but one never contained thimerosal. And the one that did stopped using it in 1999. So just maybe the risks of vaccines aren't so bad. And we're in this together, because vaccination is about community, and this is our herd. The system works really well, but it is incredibly fragile. When we dip below those herd immunity thresholds, the system begins to fail. Now, when you think of that 95% for measles, that 5% left over isn't for otherwise healthy people to dip into. It's for our friends and family that don't have the luxury of being vaccinated. Some newborn babies, young children, elderly, people with certain severe allergic reactions, people who are immune compromised. They're part of our herd, and they depend on us to protect them. So please, help us close that vaccination gap and support your herd. Thank you.
It was just over a half-century ago that every summer gripped parents across the world, especially the Western world, with fear. In its heyday of the 1940s and 1950s, polio killed or paralyzed more than 500,000 people across the world. Outbreaks led to public closures. People avoided friends and neighbors out of sheer terror that they would be struck by the disease or their children would. The unpredictable and invisible threat of polio made familiar places like playgrounds and swimming pools suddenly terrifying. So the arrival of the polio vaccine was like a liberation. The enemy previously lurking behind every corner had been vanquished. It was the tremendous relief that earlier generations felt when they no longer lost children to tetanus or diphtheria or yellow fever. More vaccines have since followed against rubella, hepatitis A and B, pneumococcal and meningococcal disease, and more. Even the holy grail, a vaccine that prevents cancer by preventing the human papillomavirus vaccine. We completely eradicated smallpox, a horrifying disease that left those who didn't die scarred for life. Every one of you survived this. Most of you because you never had it because of this. And yet, we now find ourselves in a century when we can beat back more than 24 diseases that once killed millions, and the biggest threat to public health, or one of them, is not the diseases themselves, but vaccine hesitancy, the fear that holds parents back from vaccinating their children. What happened? How did we get to this point? Well, when my first son was born, I turned down a vaccine. I didn't think it was necessary. I didn't understand it. I wasn't dumb or stupid. I was actually in grad school, but I was scared, just like hundreds of other parents I've spoken to in the 6 years that I've been reporting on this issue. Now, to be clear, I am talking about vaccine hesitancy and refusal, but I am not talking about that very tiny percentage of people who spout conspiracy theories or show up at government meetings spreading misinformation about vaccines. I'm talking about the fence sitters. Those parents are utterly terrified of doing the wrong thing, of harming their child when all they want to do is protect them. Consider this quote. In 1736, I lost one of my sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, by the smallpox. I long regretted bitterly, and still regret, that I had not given it to him by inoculation. This I mention for the sake of parents who omit that operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that therefore the safer should be chosen. That quote comes from a kind of unexpected source, a founding father of the United States, an inventor and a writer, Benjamin Franklin. If such an intelligent and worldly man as Benjamin Franklin, all those years ago, could fear vaccinating his own son, vaccine hesitancy isn't new, and those it afflicts are not ignorant or stupid. In fact, vaccine refusal rates frequently correlate with higher education. So something else is at work here. That something is what has kept us alive since we've been living in caves and hunting mammoths. It's a cognitive framework that helps us make decisions. It dictates what we pay attention to and how we assess the relative risks and benefits of different choices. It affects how we translate our beliefs and values into actions and behaviors. If we're going to address vaccine hesitancy, we have to address the underlying processes that lead people to believe in fears lacking any scientific basis. But first, let me back up. Why is vaccine hesitancy such a problem? If my children are vaccinated, why should I care if my neighbor's kids are vaccinated, aside from humanitarian reasons? Well, vaccines work in two ways. In an individual, the body makes antibodies in response to the vaccine against the disease. That standing army of antibodies then waits. If the pathogen they're trained to fight arrives, they attack it before an infection takes hold. But the second mechanism is just as important. Widespread vaccination reduces the ability of a disease to circulate. With fewer infected people walking around, fewer infected people are passing the disease along. No vaccine can prevent 100% of disease in 100% of people. So this herd immunity is essential to preventing outbreaks and protecting vulnerable individuals. But as people lose faith in vaccines, herd immunity starts breaking down. Polio returned to Syria when civil unrest interrupted polio vaccinations there. And in my home country, just last year, Mickey Mouse got measles. An outbreak of measles at Disneyland in a country that eliminated measles 16 years ago spread to 6 states and 2 other countries. That outbreak showed the power of a disease to return when vaccination rates drop. Southern California has some vaccination rates lower than those of Sudan, so that risk is clearly real. Of course, vaccines are not risk-free either. Nothing in life is. Mountains of research, however, have shown us that the risk of a very serious vaccine reaction is extremely, extremely rare. Most side effects, like fever and soreness, are mild and temporary, and protection against life-threatening diseases, meanwhile, is usually lifelong. And there's the rub. Vaccines have been so effective at reducing so much disease that we don't fear it anymore. Who fears smallpox anymore? No one. Who fears polio? Very, very few. Fear of what a vaccine might otherwise do to a child has replaced fear of the disease. The psychology term for this is availability bias, part of that cognitive framework I mentioned. You see, our brains use heuristics, mental shortcuts, to help us make sense of the world. With all of the sights and sounds and sensations and smells surrounding us at any given time, we need to know what to pay attention to and what to dismiss. We need a lightning-fast subconscious strategy for assessing our environment so we can make decisions. Heuristics gives us that. One of these is availability bias. The information that's most available or accessible to us stays at the forefront of our minds. We hear about a shark attack, we fear sharks the next time we go to the beach instead of riptides or drowning. We also fear sharks because they're predators. The same primal urge to protect ourselves and our children from predators can lead many parents to fear injecting their tiny baby's body with mysterious concoctions. Heartbreaking stories of vaccine injury, true or not, are more available to parents online and through the grapevine. They haven't seen measles or polio in their communities, so why fear them? Better not to take the risk of vaccines, right? That's what Ben Franklin thought, and he was wrong. That's omission bias, fearfully avoiding an action with a tiny risk of harm in lieu of inaction with a greater risk of harm. Those parents don't realize, unless they have Franklin's experience, that not acting is a form of action too. And if they do vaccinate and something does happen, then it's all too easy to confuse correlation with causation. The measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is given to children around the same time that autism becomes easier to diagnose. If parents notice autistic symptoms not long after their children are vaccinated, it feels natural to blame the vaccine, despite all scientific evidence to the contrary. Our brains seek patterns, and cause and effect makes the world make sense. It's incredibly difficult to deprogram that, especially when emotion is involved. Dozens of these thinking biases and errors lead parents astray. Parents think that something natural is better, but dying from disease is natural too. Most nefarious of all is confirmation bias. Our brains are incredibly protective of what we believe, and we seek out information to confirm those beliefs. We also engage in motivated reasoning to deflect threats to those beliefs at every turn, and we're simultaneously really, really lousy at assessing risk. Risk assessment requires engaging the intellect, and these automatic cognitive biases are often much stronger. That means that giving parents facts is not going to change their mind. Scientists learned long ago that our brains just aren't wired that way. Instead of a neatly arranged filing cabinet, our brains are more like overgrown mangroves with fears and facts and feelings all knotted together. As scientists are learning in ongoing research, there will be no single strategy to fostering vaccine confidence. A complex problem requires complex solutions. Sometimes harnessing those biases can work. When the norm is to vaccinate and everyone around us is vaccinating, people are more likely to follow suit. Sometimes also fear can work, for better or for worse. Unflinchingly showing people what's at stake can persuade some parents. And of course, research into genuine vaccine risks, which do exist, needs to continue, ongoing all the time. People must be reassured that scientists are constantly looking for any kind of risks associated with vaccines, assessing their safety, and ensuring that their risks are outweighed by the benefits. Public health messages, sometimes they can target specific fears of particular communities. For those who fear unnatural ingredients and value what's natural, it may help to learn that the residual formaldehyde, the tiny amounts left in some vaccines, it's no different chemically than the formaldehyde that's in a pear, and there's a lot more of it. It's in our bloodstreams. Our bodies make formaldehyde. But more than anything, confronting vaccine hesitancy requires engagement. Instead of dismissing or mocking or fearing or laughing at, mocking those who fear vaccines, we need to listen to them, genuinely listen. A person who feels heard relaxes, lets their guard down. Their cognitive biases are less engaged when the threat of being attacked goes away. There will always be a tiny percentage of people that we can't reach. There always has been. That's okay. We don't need to reach 100% of people, just enough to keep herd immunity up. When we come across someone who fears vaccines, we won't get very far by laughing, mocking, accusing. But we might get somewhere, bit by bit, with some thoughtful communication and some empathy and compassion. Thank you.
We haven't talked about the vaccine debate here on SciShow because there is no debate to have. Vaccines don't cause autism, and they save millions of lives every year. But there is a debate, whether or not it makes sense. And a lot of people counter this with ridicule, but we at SciShow aren't about judgment, we're about science and using it to better understand the world. We see the anti-vaccination movement as a phenomenon to be understood. So instead of making yet another statement about how yes, vaccines are good and no, they don't cause autism, let's use science to understand why fewer and fewer people are getting their children vaccinated. I'm Hank Green, and this is SciShow. First, let's discuss how we ended up with this imagined link between vaccinations and autism in the first place. Autism diagnoses are definitely on the rise. Now, many scientists believe that this is largely or even completely because of more effective diagnosis and changes in how the diagnosis is reported. So while the diagnoses of autism are increasing, we can't say for sure whether the incidence of autism is also increasing. If it is, it must be because of some environmental factor. Now, when we talk about autism, we're really referring to a range of developmental disorders which can affect a person's ability to communicate or socialize, or cause them to develop patterns of behavior that become pretty specific and inflexible. The condition can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, but you've probably heard of them referred to together as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. While ASD has been found to have some strong genetic components to it, there also seem to be environmental factors at work as well. And that's really the root of this controversy. We simply don't know precisely what causes autism. And in the absence of explanations, people try to make sense of it themselves, and the way our brains do that is almost entirely with cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is really just anything that skews how we process and interpret new information. There are tons of different kinds of bias. Some biases cause us to ignore certain data, others lead us to put too much emphasis on certain data. They can even drive us to focus on facts that are actually irrelevant to what we're observing. But essentially, when we hear a hypothesis and think, yeah, that makes sense, really what we're saying is, yeah, that fits with my cognitive biases. And so people blame all sorts of things for autism. Plastics, pesticides, the use of antidepressants during pregnancy, GMOs, sugar, gut bacteria, and vaccines. Basically, you start with whatever makes the most sense to the person doing the hypothesizing. The onset of autism typically happens in one of two ways. Either parents notice a delay in language development, typically around the first birthday, or they notice an apparently sudden loss of existing development, which might happen all the way through the third birthday. Now, humans are pattern recognition machines. We need to be able to figure out what behaviors and strategies lead to positive outcomes. But even more than that, we're on the lookout for things that lead to negative outcomes. This overweighting of negative outcomes is a well-known psychological effect called negativity bias. So imagine you wake up one morning and your car doesn't work. Your brain is gonna want to know what happened. Did you leave your lights on? Did you drive through a huge puddle yesterday and maybe shorted something out? There has to be some reason why it won't start. On the other hand, if you get in a 15-year-old car and it starts up just fine after having had a bad week of barely getting going, you tend not to wonder, what went right? We spend far more cognitive resources attempting to figure out why a bad thing happened than we do trying to determine why something good happened. In psychology, the search for these explanations is called explanatory attribution, and different people have different explanatory styles. Some people are more prone to blame themselves, while others search for an external event to blame. But one thing is clear, we are very bad at not blaming anything. It's not surprising that parents of children with autism, especially parents who notice a sudden loss of previous development, will search for a possible cause. And when the most significant recent event in the health of a child was a vaccination, as can be said for many moments in the life of a young American, we might identify that as a potential cause and deem that link worthy of further examination. Now, this is completely logical. The problem is that over a dozen peer-reviewed papers have found no correlation between autism and the MMR vaccine, or any other vaccine for that matter. And yet, when you Google vaccines and autism, a fair number of the results claim that there is a link between the two, and that link is being covered up up, either by the government or by big corporations. A parent, already experiencing frustration with the medical community's inability to tell them why this thing has happened to their child, will, on the internet, find a vibrant community of similarly frustrated people who share their values and experiences. These communities are full of anecdotes that draw connections between vaccines and autism, and so unsurprisingly, some people become convinced that they have found the reason for their child's disability. Once their mind has been made up, confirmation bias sets in. Confirmation bias is simply our tendency to more readily, and with less scrutiny, accept information, anecdotes, and worldviews that confirm our existing beliefs. And again, it is a completely normal thing that every person does. Indeed, trying to convince someone that a previously held belief is incorrect has been proven to actually increase their affinity for that idea. And so a community is born, and the safety of vaccines is called into question. And once the procedure for getting a vaccine goes from the doctor telling you that it is now time for a vaccine, and 99% of parents agreeing because that person went through medical school, to it being a question to ponder, vaccination rates will go down. A 2011 study showed that parents who think about vaccines before their child is born are 8 times less likely to vaccinate their children. Basically, when given an opportunity to do research on their own, what they find is confusing. And when confused, the default choice is to simply take no action. And this is an example of yet another bias called omission bias. In effect, we judge harmful actions as less moral than harmful inactions or omissions. In fact, a frequently cited study found that when the choice to vaccinate is framed as an action, the average parent will only vaccinate their child if not vaccinating is at least 2 times more dangerous than vaccinating. This has to do with our perception of future regret. Parents report that they'll feel worse if they take an action and it harms their child than if they don't act and the child is harmed by a failure to act. This perception of potential regret can be so strong that even bringing up the choice of acting versus non-acting seems to be counterproductive. A 2013 study found that attempts to convince parents to vaccinate their children actually decreased the percentage who went on to choose vaccination. If vaccination is presented as a personal choice instead of a necessity for good public health, then potentially harmful inaction can seem more moral than potentially harmful action, and vaccination rates go down. Parents are choosing to let nature take its course. And as you might expect, this effect is much stronger in people with a measurable naturalness bias. This is just a tendency to perceive things that come from nature as being inherently less threatening than things that we invent ourselves. One way psychologists measure this bias is by asking a subject if they'd prefer a substance extracted from an herb or one synthesized in a lab, even if they're chemically identical. And of course, others have biases against big government or big corporations, and these ideas about vaccinations fit well with those worldviews. Confirmation bias at work again. But even people who don't hold these biases end up being more likely not to vaccinate if they start doing research before their baby is born. This is because of another failure of the human brain. We are terrible at what psychologists call risk perception. Given the merest sliver of a possibility that vaccines will cause developmental disorders, parents are now weighing a disease they have seen, autism, against diseases they have never seen. Since the 1970s, measles has been pretty much unheard of. The measles doesn't scare people my age for the same reason a giant man-eating squirrel doesn't scare us. We've never seen it. Risk perception is basically a science all on its own, and we've found that vague future hazards, like the future probability of an illness, are far less frightening than immediate specific hazards, like the sudden onset of autism. So amazingly, the success of vaccines is one of the reasons that people are less likely to vaccinate their children. So yes, it turns out humans are complicated, and this is a complicated problem. Humans are inherently bad at understanding the effects of self-selecting samples like online anti-vaccine forums, and often completely unable to accept that a negative outcome could really be the result of something that's beyond their control, and still not very well understood. This is not an anti-vaxxer problem, it's a human problem. Those of us who trust science or have built an understanding of statistics and bias simply have had different lives than people who more heavily weight anecdotes or the opinions of their friends or strangers they meet online who feel the same way. So next time you find yourself frustrated about the decline in vaccinations in America, remember that it's only because of the dramatic success of vaccines that we could even think of having this debate. And those anti-vaccine activists are being driven by the exact same logic traps and cognitive biases that every one of us suffers from. Only by understanding and accepting these psychological pitfalls that we're all so susceptible to will we be able to solve this problem, and that is what science is all about. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, where we really do try to be objective, and we objectively believe that the universe is amazing and fantastic, and if you want to join us in understanding it and all of the stuff in it, including our brains, you can go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
Hi, I'm R.
And I'm Jay.
And today we'll be exploring the top 10 common arguments from anti-vaxxers. This list doesn't by any means cover all arguments that anti-vaxxers make, but they are the ones we hear most commonly. Let's get to it. Number 1. Vaccines are ineffective. I find this argument one of the most unusual out of the entire list, as it is just blind denial of the evidence and ignorance of basic biology. But I primarily think this one stems from ignorance of how vaccines actually work. So I'll give a quick rundown of how vaccines work. A vaccine contains a modified version of the virus. This modified version typically has its contagious and damaging abilities heavily stunted. This vaccine is then injected into the body where it currently isn't recognized by the immune system. Spindle cells will then pick up the virus and alert the immune system of it. The immune system then develops antibodies to the virus and releases them throughout the body. Lymphocytes then start attacking the virus. After the weakened version of the virus is gone, the immune system then keeps the antibodies so they can respond quickly and effectively to an exposure to the virus later in life, even in its full form. This process can be directly observed in the lab, and there are a vast number of studies outlining the mechanisms as to how vaccines work and studies on their effectiveness. You can find multiple studies examining the effects of introducing a vaccine into a heavily diseased population and drastically reducing the incidence and mortality rate of the disease. So for example, measles is a highly infectious disease caused by a virus. Before the introduction of the measles vaccine to the USA in the mid-60s, the incidence rate of measles ranged between 300 and 800,000 cases per year. But after the vaccine was licensed, that rate dropped to below 50,000 cases per year, which combined with lab demonstrations of the physiology behind the vaccine, it demonstrates the clear efficacy of the vaccine. Furthermore, the World Health Organization estimates between 2 to 3 million deaths each year are prevented by diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, and measles vaccines, but 1.5 million children under the age of 5 still die from these diseases every year as a result of low vaccination rates in their specific countries.
Number 2. Death rates declined well before the vaccine is released. Looking at overall death rates as an argument against vaccines is incredibly dishonest, or at least shows a poor understanding of the significance of these statistics. As time goes on, medical care improves at an accelerating rate, so of course the death rates of these vaccine-preventable diseases will decrease relative to the changes in medical care. It is also often argued by many anti-vaccine advocates that improvements in hygiene are responsible for the decreased incidence of vaccine-preventable diseases, rather than the vaccines themselves. This is in fact partially true. Obviously, as we better understand hygiene practices, risk of infection decreases as we are able to take preventable measures. However, this does not account for the significant decrease in infection rates that we see in highly contagious diseases, such as the measles. The issue is that improvements in medical care don't necessarily reduce the incidence rate of the disease, and hygiene is only a limited factor in the transmission of infection. Measles has an infection rate of around 90%. That's 9 out of 10 people who come in contact with the infected individual who will also become infected. Hygiene alone is not sufficient to control such a rate of infection, and though modern medicine reduces the risk of death from measles, 1 in every 20 children that gets measles will get pneumonia. In the early 1900s, that would mean death. However, as medical care improves, that pneumonia no longer always results in death. But regardless, the children still had to get and suffer through the experience of having pneumonia, not to mention any of the long-term side effects it could leave them with. Vaccines prevent you from being dragged into intensive care to receive emergency medical care and winding up with long-term side effects like loss of hearing. With vaccines, however, someone may wind up having a sore arm for a day and in very, very rare instances, a serious but treatable reaction. In both scenarios, no one dies, so the statistics don't represent the issue. However, one scenario is clearly the better one for the population. Death rates say absolutely nothing about the other serious side effects or suffering associated with getting the disease.
3. There are no independent studies supporting vaccines. Now, there are a vast number of studies, and these studies come from multiple sources, including but not limited to public and private universities, government and private medical research facilities, and multiple pharmaceutical company labs. These diverse sources of research all publish their findings to the same group of journals, and from these journals, the sources take information and attempt to replicate and expand on the results. The only way this research could be not taken into consideration is if every single one of these is engaged in a global conspiracy to lie, as all it would take is one research facility to ruin this entire conspiracy. But we will save conspiracy talk for later. However, if you are looking for a list of studies, make sure to read the description section of this video.
Number 4. If vaccines are effective, then people shouldn't be concerned about unvaccinated children in schools. This argument demonstrates a lack of understanding in regards to herd immunity and the large-scale dangers of an unvaccinated and dense population. Firstly, vaccines are not 100% effective. An individual immunized against a particular virus is still able to become infected with that disease if the immune response is not sufficient to fight against the infection. In fact, some immunizations only last a few years before the efficiency of the immune response is no longer sufficient to fight against the disease, and booster shots may be needed to maintain a strong immunity. A good example of this scenario is whooping cough. Many people may not have a strong enough immune response when given the immunization for whooping cough. However, those who are immunized against whooping cough demonstrate significantly reduced symptoms and are often not contagious to others. This significantly reduces the impact of the disease. When combined with herd immunity, this makes the impact of immunization even greater. Herd immunity is the principle that immune-vulnerable individuals within a population are shielded against infection by those with strong immunity. Contagious diseases have very little impact when they are unable to spread within a population. By strengthening the majority of the population against the disease, barriers are created between the disease and the immune-vulnerable individuals. This is especially important for people highly susceptible to disease, such as infants, the elderly, and the immunocompromised. So when an unvaccinated child is introduced into an environment with high chance of spreading a contagion, they may still pose a risk to others, even those vaccinated against the very same disease. Vaccines are about limiting any opportunity for the spread of a contagion, not just the protection of an individual.
Number 5. Pharmaceutical companies don't care about the efficacy of vaccines, they only care about money. Yes, pharmaceutical industries make money from vaccines, but that doesn't mean by default that that's all they care about. They make money from them because they are an effective product that can be distributed on a large scale. But if the argument is that they aren't effective and vaccine companies lied to keep the money, then I can say it wouldn't be worth it for them. In 2010, pharmaceutical companies made around $1.3 trillion US from various sources. However, from vaccines they made about $24 billion. This means vaccines attribute for about 1.82% of the pharmaceutical total income, which is a tiny portion of their income. It is also worth noting that out of that $24 billion income from vaccines, $10.5 billion of it is profits, making the profit margin about 43.8%, as opposed to the average of non-vaccine pharmaceutical profit margins of about 46.3%. This makes vaccines about 2.5% less effective at generating profits compared to the other things that pharmaceutical companies sell. In summary, pharmaceutical companies have a vast range of income sources, and vaccines only attribute for a tiny portion of that income. That tiny portion of income isn't worth having a global conspiracy of causing serious harm to children for. Pharmaceutical companies make considerably more money off the medicine and equipment that would be used to treat someone who is hospitalized due to vaccines, as opposed to the vaccines that are used to prevent diseases. If anything, they would make more money if they eliminated vaccines and just allowed everyone to get the diseases and be hospitalized. It is also worth noting that the companies would stand to lose money if they were selling an ineffective product, as they would get sued constantly and have to fork out money to the National Vaccine Compensation Program, along with the damage to their company that they would suffer as a result of public scrutiny. Someone would need to demonstrate that vaccines don't work, and then demonstrate that the companies are aware of this before this argument against vaccines could hold any water, and no one has done either of these things.
Number 6. Vaccines cause autism. Well, I'm sure we all knew this one was coming. Let's just make this one clear and simple. There is no evidence linking vaccines with autism. The only study reporting a link between vaccines and autism was a study by Andrew Wakefield. He released this study and nobody could replicate his results. It was later discovered that he fabricated his results for a group of lawyers who wanted to sue a pharmaceutical company. Following this, Andrew Wakefield had his medical license revoked and has been relegated to the lands of natural news for the rest of his days. It is also worth noting that even if the Andrew Wakefield study was true, it only showed a possible relationship. It didn't actually demonstrate a mechanism as to how vaccines could cause autism. Finally, a multitude of studies, even ones privately funded by anti-vaccine groups, have now been conducted, showing time and time again in multiple population groups that there is absolutely no link between vaccines and autism. I'm sure the debate will go on, but if evidence speaks for itself, then this argument has no voice.
Number 7. Vaccines contain dangerous chemicals such as formaldehyde and mercury. It seems almost every month that the anti-vaccine crowd has moved on to claiming a new ingredient in vaccines is now killing our children. Now, we can't possibly sit here and kick balls at ever-shifting goalposts all day, but we can outline this. Vaccine safety has been heavily studied. It is one of the most well-explored things in science, and no evidence suggests that they are a public health risk. Almost everybody you ever meet has been vaccinated with no real issue to their health. Now, the two most commonly complained about ingredients in vaccines are formaldehyde and mercury, so we can talk about these quickly. The dose makes the toxin. Some things are deadly at certain levels and not dangerous at all at other levels. The amount of formaldehyde in vaccines is minuscule compared to the amount that the body actually produces itself, which is about 100 times higher than that found in vaccines. Yes, you heard us right. Your body actually produces formaldehyde, as it is essential for the production of biological materials. The amount in vaccines is absolutely no danger to humans. On the other hand, thimerosal is a compound that contains mercury, and it was used to prevent the growth of dangerous microbes in vaccines. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that thimerosal was associated with any negative health effects, as the levels are so low that they can be removed easily by the body. To add to this, so many people were worried about mercury in vaccines that mercury hasn't been a part of the vast majority of vaccines for over 15 years. Again, this argument holds no water against vaccines, as there is no evidence to suggest thimerosal is dangerous. There is lots of evidence to suggest it's safe in the dose it is given, and there is only a very small number of vaccines that even still use thimerosal.
Number 8. Vaccines cause more harm than good. This claim can be easily refuted using simple math. These vaccines exist because the disease they fight are highly contagious and have a deceivingly high rate of complications. So much so that governments supply millions of dollars in funding research to get many of these vaccines ready as fast as possible. For example, measles is so contagious that each person who gets it will infect 90% of the people they come in contact with, excluding those who are already immune. The disease has a death rate of around 1 in 2,500 cases. So when 1 million children get measles, 400 will die. And in further complications, 1 in every 20 children that gets measles will get pneumonia. So if 1 million children get measles, then 50,000 will get pneumonia, which puts them at serious risk of permanent injury. On a large scale, the toll really starts to add up. The complication rate of vaccines doesn't even come close to this. For example, the incidence rate of allergic reactions, such as anaphylaxis with the MMR vaccine, is 3.5 to 10 per 1 million doses. So if 1 million children get the vaccine, at most 10 children will have a serious allergic reaction, and this reaction does not necessarily mean death or even permanent injury. These allergic reactions usually stem from a pre-susceptibility as opposed to a problem with the vaccine itself. It is also worth noting that we haven't even included the negative effects of mumps and rubella in the analysis, and the vaccine still comes out on top. Now, these numbers may vary depending on which vaccine you do the cost-benefit analysis of, but the vaccine will always come out as doing more good than harm. The only times when it seems like they don't are when the numbers are presented dishonestly, so they include minor side effects, such as sore arms after the needle injection, or when the vaccines are blamed for side effects where there is no actual causal link between the vaccine and the side effect. A good example of this is what happened with the HPV vaccine in Japan, where news and social media reported unverified cases of complications related to the vaccine, and the government was forced to retract its recommendation for the vaccine because of misinformed public outrage and fear, despite being advised against this by the World Health Organization. Check out our links in the description for more information. In summary, the World Health Organization estimates that 2 to 3 million deaths are prevented each year due to vaccinations, with minimal serious side effects. This is a massive good.
Number 9. Vaccine-preventable diseases are no longer a risk in my country, so there's no need to vaccinate. This is possibly the most interesting argument on this list, as this argument exists purely because vaccines are so effective and have eliminated these diseases from people's recent memory. Now, while it is true that a lot of diseases have reached minuscule levels in some countries, they still exist, and once the population is less resistant to the disease, those small pockets of the disease will be able to spread out again as they are highly infectious. Now, even if a disease is completely eradicated in one country, all it takes is for someone to come over on a plane from a different country that still has the disease, and now it can explode into a population that has no resistance to it. Our world is so interconnected these days that only once a disease is completely eradicated from every corner of the globe can we consider the disease to no longer be a risk.
Number 10. My friend's child got vaccinated and then X happened. This argument typically manifests itself in something to the effect of, my friend's child got vaccinated and then was diagnosed with autism. We've already talked about the problems with vaccinations being linked to autism, but this section addresses the underlying thought pattern which leads to this argument, as well as similar arguments about the side effects of vaccines. Possibly the most popular example of this is the one presented by Jenny McCarthy, who spoke out publicly against vaccines when her son was diagnosed with autism after he was vaccinated. This is textbook post hoc reasoning, as multiple things can be chosen to fill the place of X. And the response is relatively easy. By saying my child got vaccinated and then won a sprint competition at his high school athletics carnival, so vaccines must improve athleticism. I did a fart and found $10 on the floor, maybe farts are made of money. Or, I prayed to natural news before winning at slot machines, hence, praying to natural news causes people to win at slot machines. But satire aside, it's actually not that unreasonable to turn to a recent and unique event to try and explain a similarly unique and recent outcome. That is because lots of things happen in correlation with each other every day, and humans are evolved to identify these patterns. However, this often results in people finding patterns where there are none. This is the reason we must implement the scientific method. We use it to minimize human bias as much as possible, and when we do this in regard to vaccines and autism, or vaccines and other undocumented side effects, there is no evidence to suggest vaccines cause a lot of the negative things they are accused of causing. In fact, there isn't even a large-scale correlation. Vaccines do have side effects, and some of them are very serious, but the incidence of these side effects is incredibly low and often affects people who are immunocompromised or especially susceptible to reaction. The reality is that people can have a negative reaction to almost anything. In order to prove a common cause and effect, you require both a correlation and a mechanism. So maybe your friend's child did have a bad reaction to the vaccine, or maybe it just appears that way. In either case, there are thousands of scientists around the world attempting to find both a correlation and a mechanism for such events, and so far, neither exists for many of the things people are claiming. We have to accept a degree of risk with everything, while continuously trying to reduce that risk. And as far as medicine goes, vaccines are one of the safest bets you can make. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for regular videos, like this video, and share it around to help us raise the bar of public discourse.